Welcome, cherished audience, to this exploration of the culinary world of medieval times. As you find your moment of tranquility and repose, I encourage you to let us know in the comments section your location on the globe and the current time. For you, I genuinely appreciate seeing the extent of our night owl community. If you find relaxation in delving into the elaborate fabric of history, please think about subscribing for additional calming narratives like this one. Envision, if you can, a plain table arranged with a simple meal, a serving of thin, flavorless porridge, a substantial piece of heavy, rough bread, and possibly a few bits of tough, sinewy meat, should the eater be fortunate. This was the typical food that nourished the bulk of the populace in medieval days. While monarchs and the aristocracy indulged in opulent multi-course banquets, the ordinary peasant made do with a diet that was as scant as it was repetitive. What circumstances converged to make nourishment in the Middle Ages so unappealing for the general populace? Let us investigate this query and take a mental voyage back to an era when satisfying hunger was a daily challenge. Within a medieval peasant's dwelling, the scent of exotic spices was conspicuously absent. Cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, these were extravagances kept for the affluent, transported from far-off lands by daring merchants. Consider the existence of a spice merchant in that period, traversing the dangerous Silk Road to deliver a hint of luxury to European coastlines. To understand the worth attributed to these uncommon flavors, reflect that in the 11th century, a pound of nutmeg was valued at 7 fattened oxen. The exorbitant cost of spices meant that common individuals had to rely on the strong tastes of garlic, mustard, and vinegar to add zest to their simple meals. The insipidity of peasant cooking was further compounded by the lack of fresh produce. Lacking dependable preservation methods, fruits and vegetables were, at best, seasonal indulgences. The fortunate few with access to a parcel of land might cultivate some robust crops, like onions, leeks, and cabbages. However, these were insufficient to provide balance to a diet predominantly based on grains. Breads and porridges, crafted from barley, rye, and wheat, constituted the core of most meals, sometimes augmented with legumes such as peas and beans. While this diet was filling, it was deficient in vital nutrients, resulting in widespread malnutrition and impaired growth. Meat, although highly valued, was a seldom seen item on the peasant's table. A more prosperous family might own a pig, some chickens, or perhaps a cow. But these creatures were precious assets, not to be killed without serious consideration. Meat was kept for significant events like weddings and religious festivals, or when an animal became too old or sick to be of other use. When meat was obtainable, every part was utilized, from snout to tail. Offal, or organ meats, were standard peasant fare, as were small, fowl, and game acquired through trapping or hunting. Though poaching in royal forests was a dangerous pursuit, met with harsh punishments, fish was more readily available than meat for those residing near rivers or the ocean, but it too was frequently preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to ensure it lasted through lean periods. The outcome was vastly different from the tender, flaky fillets we savor today. Herring, cod, and eel were among the most frequent catches, and they would be densely packed in barrels with copious salt to prevent decay. Freshwater fish, such as carp and pike, were delicacies afforded only by the nobility, who kept private fish ponds on their estates. The rarity of fresh food compelled medieval cooks to be inventive with preservation techniques. Pickling, fermentation, and drying were all prevalent methods to prolong the usability of perishable items. Cabbage would be shredded and fermented to create sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions pickled in vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears dried for winter consumption. These preserved foods introduced some much-needed diversity to the peasant diet, but they were a pale imitation of the lively flavors of fresh ingredients. Even fundamental items like bread and ale, which were the bedrock of medieval sustenance, were not always dependable. Dishonest bakers might extend their dough with additives such as ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust, producing loaves that were as solid as stone and similarly nutritious. Ale, too, was frequently diluted to boost profits, a behavior that gave some alewives a notorious reputation. In an age when clean drinking water was uncommon, weak ale was often the sole safe option, as the brewing process helped eliminate harmful bacteria. This leads us to what might be the most distasteful feature of medieval dining: the complete absence of hygiene. Without knowledge of germs and food safety, contamination was widespread. Livestock were often housed near living areas for warmth and security, their waste permeating the same spaces where food was prepared and eaten. In congested cities, refuse and human excrement littered the streets, polluting water supplies and attracting vermin. It is hardly surprising that foodborne illnesses were common, with even royalty not safe from the dangers of spoiled provisions. King John of England, for instance, is reputed to have died after excessively consuming peaches and new cider, a repast that probably resulted in a lethal case of dysentery. The threat of disease was a constant presence at the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which decimated a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread partly due to the unsanitary environments that allowed rats and fleas to flourish. Food markets were particularly infamous as breeding sites for pestilence, with flies swarming around meat vendors and rodents darting beneath stalls. It is remarkable that anyone endured the hazards of medieval dining at all, yet even amidst scarcity and illness, there were sparks of culinary optimism. Monasteries and abbeys frequently acted as havens of comparative abundance, with meticulously cared for gardens and orchards yielding a plentiful supply of fresh produce. Monks were celebrated for their cooking abilities, with some even authoring cookbooks that provided insights into the more sophisticated cuisine of the upper classes. Naturally, this food was not readily shared with the general populace, but some monasteries did provide alms to the impoverished as a form of charity. For the aristocracy, feasts were a means to display their affluence and influence. A royal banquet could include dozens of courses, from roasted swan and peacock to intricate pastries and sweet confections. Spices were used generously, as were wine and ale, fostering an atmosphere of excessive merriment. But even these opulent spreads were not without their risks. Food poisoning was a frequent problem, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces affecting noble digestions, and the sheer quantity of food eaten could result in severe digestive discomfort, a reminder that even the privileged were not exempt from the dangers of medieval dining. As we contemplate the severe conditions of food in the Middle Ages, it is difficult not to experience a sense of appreciation for the plenty and diversity we have today. Our supermarkets are filled with fresh produce from all over the world. Our meats are safe and processed hygienically, and our spice collections contain flavors that would have been coveted by any medieval ruler. Nevertheless, even as we enjoy the benefits of modern times, we cannot help but be impressed by the fortitude and cleverness of our forebears, who managed with so little and discovered methods to survive despite relentless adversity. So, the next occasion you have a meal, pause to acknowledge the bounty before you. Relish the tastes and textures that medieval peasants could only imagine, and offer a toast to the innumerable generations who labored and struggled to bring us to this stage. And if you find yourself complaining about a less than ideal dish, consider the medieval diner, for whom even a basic bowl of porridge was a hard-earned blessing. As we allow our thoughts to return to that remote past, let us find comfort in the understanding that we are the fortunate beneficiaries of centuries of culinary advancement, and let us not overlook the lessons history offers, lessons of resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring strength of the human spirit to find sustenance and happiness even in the bleakest periods. And so, dear listener, I wish you good night and pleasant dreams of a world where food is not merely a requirement, but a source of boundless pleasure. May your own culinary explorations be rich in flavor, nourishment, and the comforting glow of gratitude for all that we possess. Until our next meeting, rest soundly and dream of feasts yet to come. Part 4. Tainted Food and Drink. In the dimly lit thoroughfares of a medieval urban center, a baker furtively looks around before retreating into his establishment. He a bag of sawdust and starts to incorporate it into his dough, augmenting his scant flour supply. For numerous bakers, this deceit was the sole method to secure a meager existence. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, yet its integrity was frequently compromised. Unscrupulous bakers would introduce fillers, like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust, to increase their dough. The outcome was a rough, gritty loaf that provided minimal nutrition, the very staple that sustained peasants through their arduous labor, had transformed into another hardship to bear. Ale and wine also succumbed to the desperation of the era. Alewives and innkeepers, striving to make a profit, would dilute their brews to extend them. The resulting beverage was a weak, acidic liquid that barely resembled the robust ale that was a hallmark of the British Isles. One such alewife, Elizabeth, labors over her simmering cauldron, adding another pail of murky water. Her children linger nearby, their hungry gaze fixed on each drop, aware that their subsequent meal hinges on this batch. As she pours a mug of the thinned brew, she sighs, recalling the rich, potent ale her grandmother once produced, a family recipe now sacrificed to necessity. In an age when unpolluted drinking water was scarce, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate requirement. Wells and rivers were often polluted by human and animal refuse, making them breeding grounds for disease. The alcohol in these drinks, though weakened, was still sufficiently strong to eliminate some of the detrimental bacteria. Consequently, peasants had to choose between the risk of illness from contaminated water and the insubstantial calories of diluted ale. Efforts were made to control these deceptive practices. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th century statute, established stringent rules regarding the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. Violators faced substantial fines or even confinement in the pillory. However, with inadequate enforcement and the dire poverty of the populace, these laws had little effect in stopping food adulteration. Thus, the medieval peasant's existence was one of perpetual compromise, a delicate balance between the gnawing ache of hunger and the sharp disappointment of tainted food. Each bite served as a reminder of their unstable lives, where even the most fundamental sustenance was not guaranteed. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, we must remember that these were not merely historical data, but the everyday struggles of actual individuals. In our subsequent chapter, we will examine how the very environments in which they lived contributed to the difficulties they encountered in obtaining a satisfactory meal. The confined spaces shared by humans and animals, and the absence of sanitation that afflicted medieval cities, rendered the simple act of eating a hazardous undertaking. Part 5. Unsanitary environments. Envision, if you please, a small straw-roofed cottage braced against the harshness of a medieval winter. Inside, a family gathers around a scant fire, their exhalations mixing with the vapor rising from a simmering pot of pottage. In a corner, a pig forages through the rushes strewn across the earthen floor. It snorts and grunts, a persistent sound accompanying the family's daily routine. This was the norm for many medieval peasants, a life spent in immediate proximity to their farm animals. Animals were frequently housed indoors for warmth and security, their manure and waste mingling with the straw and rushes that served as the sole floor covering. It was an ideal environment for disease, with fleas and lice flourishing in the unsanitary state. Even in the most magnificent castles, sanitation posed a significant problem. Lacking a proper grasp of hygiene, even the most extravagant feasts could culminate in disaster. The tale of King John of England offers a striking illustration. In 1216, while journeying across the land, the king became ill after overindulging in peaches. Historians now surmise these peaches were likely spoiled, resulting in a case of dysentery that ultimately proved fatal for the king. In the densely populated cities of medieval Europe, the circumstances were even more alarming. Confined streets were congested with refuse and human excrement, polluting the air and contaminating the water sources. In London, the River Thames functioned as both a supplier of drinking water and a repository for the city's waste. It is hardly surprising that disease was rampant, with frequent outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the feared Black Death. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, was able to disseminate so rapidly and claim so many lives partly due to the unsanitary conditions prevalent in medieval cities. Fleas, transported by rats that thrived in the filth, became the unwitting carriers of the plague, transmitting the disease from person to person with horrifying speed. For the ordinary peasant, there was scant escape from these unsanitary environments. They lived and perished amidst the squalor, their bodies enfeebled by malnutrition and continuous exposure to illness. Even the simple act of eating, which ought to have been a source of sustenance and solace, transformed into a gamble with every mouthful. As we reflect on these realities, it is natural to feel a sense of despondency for the predicament of the medieval peasant. Yet amidst this gloom, there were flickers of light, the generosity of neighbors sharing their meager provisions, the comfort derived from faith and community. In our upcoming chapter, we will investigate how the Church, despite its own contribution to the hardships of the period, also provided a degree of solace and optimism to the hungry and oppressed. Part 6. The Church's Impact. The chiming of church bells set the tempo of existence in medieval Europe. For peasants laboring in the fields, these sounds signified not merely a summons to prayer, but also a temporary relief from the ceaseless toil of their labor and their hunger. In a world fraught with uncertainty, the Church represented a pillar of stability and power. However, this power was accompanied by its own regulations and limitations, many of which concerned food. The Catholic Church enforced regular fasting and meatless days, especially during the reflective season of Lent. For 40 days preceding Easter, believers were required to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs, a significant demand for those already finding it difficult to secure food. The experience of one peasant family highlights the severity these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret worked from dawn till dusk on their small piece of land, barely cultivating enough to sustain their 3 children. When Lent commenced, they confronted a difficult decision: observe the fast and risk further weakening their already undernourished bodies, or disobey the Church and face the repercussions for their eternal souls. Ultimately, they chose to adhere to the fast, surviving on scant servings of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were emaciated, and their movements were labored with fatigue. Yet, they found comfort in the conviction that their suffering would be recompensed in the afterlife. Despite the added difficulties these fasts created, the Church was not entirely insensitive to the plight of the impoverished. Monasteries and abbeys frequently served as sources of food assistance, distributing bread and alms to the destitute as an act of Christian benevolence. The monks, with their extensive lands and resources, could offer some relief to the hungry populace. Nevertheless, even this charity had its restrictions. When crops failed and famine ensued, the need for aid often surpassed the Church's capacity to provide, and for those apprehended poaching in the royal forest a desperate measure to augment their meager diets with fresh game. The Church's compassion was conspicuously lacking. Poachers, if captured, encountered severe penalties, from mutilation to execution, irrespective of their circumstances. Consequently, the Church's influence on medieval food was a mixed blessing. It offered comfort and assistance to some while placing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was simultaneously a wellspring of strength and a further trial to be faced amidst relentless hunger. As we shift our focus to the concluding chapter of our exploration of medieval food, we will observe a scene of striking disparity. The lavish feast of a noble household, juxtaposed with peasant hardship. These extravagant displays serve as a stark testament to the immense inequalities that characterized the era. Part 7. The infrequent medieval feast. The great hall of the castle is illuminated by the dancing light of 100 candles. Tapestries adorn the walls, their rich threads depicting tales of brave exploits and romantic devotion. At the room's head, on an elevated platform, the lord and lady oversee a spectacle of opulence and abundance. Down the hall's center, a colossal oak table strains under the weight of innumerable dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skins crisp and golden, compete for space with exquisite silver platters of delicately seasoned peacock. Baskets are laden with freshly baked manchet bread, each loaf as white and fluffy as a cloud. The atmosphere is saturated with the scents of saffron, cinnamon, and clove spices, so valuable they command their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the head cook directs a culinary symphony. He issues commands to his assistants, who rush to baste meats, stir simmering pots, and arrange elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures, molded into whimsical forms of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast represents an opportunity to display his skill and creativity, to enhance his reputation and ensure his standing in his lord's esteem. As the feast unfolds, the attendees indulge in a seemingly endless succession of courses. They relish the tender meat of roasted venison, sip creamy almond soup, and enjoy the subtle taste of blancmange, a preparation of shredded chicken combined with rice, milk, and sugar. They accompany it all with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. Yet even amidst this joyous celebration, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval existence. A noble woman, her face flushed from wine, suddenly turns pale and makes her excuses from the table, her stomach unsettled by the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth decaying from sugary treats, bites into a particularly tough piece of meat and flinches in pain. Of the British Isles, one such alewife, Elizabeth, labors over her simmering cauldron, adding another pail of murky water. Her children linger nearby, their hungry gaze fixed on each drop, aware that their subsequent meal hinges on this batch. As she pours a mug of the thinned brew, she sighs, recalling the rich, potent ale her grandmother once produced, a family recipe now sacrificed to necessity. In an age when unpolluted drinking water was scarce, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate requirement. Wells and rivers were often polluted by human and animal refuse, making them breeding grounds for disease. The alcohol in these drinks, though weakened, was still sufficiently strong to eliminate some of the detrimental bacteria. Consequently, peasants had to choose between the risk of illness from contaminated water and the insubstantial calories of diluted ale. Efforts were made to control these deceptive practices. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th century statute, established stringent rules regarding the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. Violators faced substantial fines or even confinement in the pillory. However, with inadequate enforcement and the dire poverty of the populace, these laws had little effect in stopping food adulteration. Thus, the medieval peasant's existence was one of perpetual compromise, a delicate balance between the gnawing ache of hunger and the sharp disappointment of tainted food. Each bite served as a reminder of their unstable lives, where even the most fundamental sustenance was not guaranteed. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, we must remember that these were not merely historical data, but the everyday struggles of actual individuals. In our subsequent chapter, we will examine how the very environments in which they lived contributed to the difficulties they encountered in obtaining a satisfactory meal. The confined spaces shared by humans and animals, and the absence of sanitation that afflicted medieval cities, rendered the simple act of eating a hazardous undertaking. Part 5. Unsanitary environments. Envision, if you please, a small straw cottage braced against the harshness of a medieval winter. Inside, a family gathers around a scant fire, their exhalations mixing with the vapor rising from a simmering pot of pottage. In a corner, a pig forages through the rushes strewn across the earthen floor. It snorts and grunts, a persistent sound accompanying the family's daily routine. This was the norm for many medieval peasants, a life spent in immediate proximity to their farm animals. Animals were frequently housed indoors for warmth and security, their manure and waste mingling with the straw and rushes that served as the sole floor covering. It was an ideal environment for disease, with fleas and lice flourishing in the unsanitary state. Even in the most magnificent castles, sanitation posed a significant problem. Lacking a proper grasp of hygiene, even the most extravagant feasts could culminate in disaster. The tale of King John of England offers a striking illustration. In 1216, while journeying across the land, the king became ill after overindulging in peaches. Historians now surmise these peaches were likely spoiled, resulting in a case of dysentery that ultimately proved fatal for the king. In the densely populated cities of medieval Europe, the circumstances were even more alarming. Confined streets were congested with refuse and human excrement, polluting the air and contaminating the water sources. In London, the River Thames functioned as both a supplier of drinking water and a repository for the city's waste. It is hardly surprising that disease was rampant, with frequent outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even the feared Black Death. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, was able to disseminate so rapidly and claim so many lives partly due to the unsanitary conditions prevalent in medieval cities. Fleas, transported by rats that thrived in the filth, became the unwitting carriers of the plague, transmitting the disease from person to person with horrifying speed. For the ordinary peasant, there was scant escape from these unsanitary environments. They lived and perished amidst the squalor, their bodies enfeebled by malnutrition and continuous exposure to illness. Even the simple act of eating, which ought to have been a source of sustenance and solace, transformed into a gamble with every mouthful. As we reflect on these realities, it is natural to feel a sense of despondency for the predicament of the medieval peasant. Yet, amidst this gloom, there were flickers of light, the generosity of neighbors sharing their meager provisions, the comfort derived from faith and community. In our upcoming chapter, we will investigate how the Church, despite its own contribution to the hardships of the period, also provided a degree of solace and optimism to the hungry and oppressed. Part 6. The Church's Impact. The chiming of church bells set the tempo of existence in medieval Europe. For peasants laboring in the fields, these sounds signified not merely a summons to prayer, but also a temporary relief from the ceaseless toil of their labor and their hunger. In a world fraught with uncertainty, the Church represented a pillar of stability and power. However, this power was accompanied by its own regulations and limitations, many of which concerned food. The Catholic Church enforced regular fasting and meatless days, especially during the reflective season of Lent. For 40 days preceding Easter, believers were required to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs, a significant demand for those already finding it difficult to secure food. The experience of one peasant family highlights the severity these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret worked from dawn till dusk on their small piece of land, barely cultivating enough to sustain their 3 children. When Lent commenced, they confronted a difficult decision: observe the fast and risk further weakening their already undernourished bodies, or disobey the Church and face the repercussions for their eternal souls. Ultimately, they chose to adhere to the fast, surviving on scant servings of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter their faces were emaciated, and their movements were labored with fatigue. Yet, they found comfort in the conviction that their suffering would be recompensed in the afterlife. Despite the added difficulties these fasts created, the Church was not entirely insensitive to the plight of the impoverished. Monasteries and abbeys frequently served as sources of food assistance, distributing bread and alms to the destitute as an act of Christian benevolence. The monks, with their extensive lands and resources, could offer some relief to the hungry populace. Nevertheless, even this charity had its restrictions. When crops failed and famine ensued, the need for aid often surpassed the church's capacity to provide. And for those apprehended poaching in the royal forests, desperate measure to augment their meager diets with fresh game, the church's compassion was conspicuously lacking. Poachers, if captured, encountered severe penalties, from mutilation to execution, irrespective of their circumstances. Consequently, the church's influence on medieval food was a mixed blessing. It offered comfort and assistance to some while placing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was simultaneously a wellspring of strength and a further trial to be faced amidst relentless hunger. As we shift our focus to the concluding chapter of our exploration of medieval food, we will observe a scene of striking disparity, the lavish feast of a noble household, juxtaposed with peasant hardship. These extravagant displays serve as a stark testament to the immense inequalities that characterized the era. Part 7. The infrequent medieval feast. The great hall of the castle is illuminated by the dancing light of 100 candles. Tapestries adorn the walls, their rich threads depicting tales of brave exploits and romantic devotion. At the room's head, on an elevated platform, the lord and lady oversee a spectacle of opulence and abundance. Down the hall's center, a colossal oak table strains under the weight of innumerable dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skins crisp and golden, compete for space with exquisite silver platters of delicately seasoned peacock. Baskets are laden with freshly baked manchet bread, each loaf as white and fluffy as a cloud. The atmosphere is saturated with the scents of saffron, cinnamon, and clove spices, so valuable they command their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the head cook directs a culinary symphony. He issues commands to his assistants, who rush to baste meats, stir simmering pots, and arrange elaborate subtlety sugar sculptures molded into whimsical forms of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast represents an opportunity to display his skill and creativity, to enhance his reputation and ensure his standing in his lord's esteem. As the feast unfolds, the attendees indulge in a seemingly endless succession of courses. They relish the tender meat of roasted venison, sip creamy almond soup, and enjoy the subtle taste of blancmange, a preparation of shredded chicken combined with rice, milk, and sugar. They accompany it all with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. Yet, even amidst this joyous celebration, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval existence. A noble woman, her face flushed from wine, suddenly turns pale and makes her excuses from the table, her stomach unsettled by the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth decaying from sugary treats, bites into a particularly tough piece of meat and flinches in pain. Part 7. The infrequent medieval feast. The great hall of the castle is illuminated by the dancing light of 100 candles. Tapestries adorn the walls, their rich threads depicting tales of brave exploits and romantic devotion. At the room's head, on an elevated platform, the lord and lady oversee a spectacle of opulence and abundance. Down the hall's center, a colossal oak table strains under the weight of innumerable dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skins crisp and golden, compete for space with exquisite silver platters of delicately seasoned peacock. Baskets are laden with freshly baked manchet bread, each loaf as white and fluffy as a cloud. The atmosphere is saturated with the scents of saffron, cinnamon, and clove spices so valuable they command their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the head cook directs a culinary symphony. He issues commands to his assistants, who rush to baste meats, stir simmering pots, and arrange elaborate subtleties sugar sculptures, molded into whimsical forms of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast represents an opportunity to display his skill and creativity, to enhance his reputation and ensure his standing in his lord's esteem. As the feast unfolds, the attendees indulge in a seemingly endless succession of courses. They relish the tender meat of roasted venison, sip creamy almond soup, and enjoy the subtle taste of blancmange, a preparation of shredded chicken combined with rice, milk, and sugar. They accompany it all with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. Yet, even amidst this joyous celebration, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval existence. A noblewoman, her face flushed from wine, suddenly turns pale and makes her excuses from the table, her stomach unsettled by the richness of the food. A knight, his teeth decaying from sugary treats, bites into a particularly tough piece of meat and flinches in pain. And, lingering at the hall's periphery, the serving staff observe the excesses of their superiors with a mix of longing and resentment. They are aware that tomorrow they will return to their customary diet of coarse bread and thin gruel. The memory of this feast, a taunting illustration of the divide between their reality and that of their masters. As the final dishes are removed, and the last remnants are cleared, we are left to contemplate the stark disparities of medieval food. For the nobility, feasts were a demonstration of wealth, social standing, and authority, a chance to delight in the finest provisions the land could provide. But for the overwhelming majority, food was a daily ordeal, a relentless struggle against scarcity, adulteration, and illness. In our contemporary world of plenty and choice, it is easy to overlook the hardships endured by our medieval predecessors. Yet, by comprehending their struggles, we develop a more profound appreciation for the comforts we experience today. As we partake in our own meals, let us pause to relish not only the flavors on our palates, but also the hard-won progress that enables us to eat with such ease and variety. And so, as we conclude this examination of medieval food, let us do so with a sense of gratitude and perspective. For in the grand narrative of human history, our own period is but a brief and fortunate chapter, crafted from the threads of countless lives lived in meals shared, each a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Conclusion. As we have journeyed through the landscape of medieval food, we have encountered a world of scarcity, hardship, and inequality. From the bland monotony of peasant pottage to the dangerous fillers in adulterated bread, the challenges of feeding oneself in the Middle Ages were unrelenting. We have seen how the lack of variety in spices, the difficulties of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions all conspired to make medieval food a far cry from the cornucopias we enjoy today. We have witnessed the impact of the Church's fasting edicts, adding spiritual burdens to the already heavy load of the poor, and we have marveled at the opulent feasts of the nobility, a glittering contrast to the grim realities faced by most. But through it all, we have also seen glimmers of humanity's indomitable spirit, the ingenuity of cooks making the most of meager ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing what little they had, and the solace found in the rituals of faith and feast. In our modern world, it is easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can dine in restaurants serving cuisines from around the globe, or have a world of flavors delivered right to our doorstep. But imagine for a moment transporting a medieval peasant into the aisles of a modern grocery store. The sheer variety would be overwhelming. The vibrant colors of the produce section, the gleaming refrigerated cases filled with milk and eggs, the shelves upon shelves of pre-packaged meals and snacks. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We grapple with the environmental impact of our food systems, with issues of access and inequality, and with the health consequences of overabundance. In our quest for convenience and choice, we sometimes forget the value of simplicity, of seasonal eating and local flavors. Perhaps, then, there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors. even as we appreciate how far we have come. We can embrace the joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, the satisfaction of a dish made with care and creativity. We can remember the value of preserving and cherishing the bounty of the earth rather than taking it for granted. And most of all, we can approach our own meals with a sense of gratitude and wonder, recognizing the incredible journey that food has taken to reach our plates. From the sun-drenched fields to the bustling kitchens, to the warmth of our own tables, each bite is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit across the ages. So as we end our journey through the annals of medieval food, let us raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup, to the countless generations who came before us. Through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes, they laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today. And in honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where all may eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. As the royal cook bustled about the castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast, most of his fellow countrymen could only dream of such opulence. For the serf toiling in the fields, a meal was a simple affair of coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew of whatever vegetables or scraps could be found. On a good day, there might be a bit of salted pork or dried fish to add some flavor to the gruel-like mix. But more often than not, it was a bland and unsatisfying fare that left the belly only half full. The life of a peasant in medieval times was one of unrelenting hardship, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their daily sustenance. While the nobles dined on exotic dishes flavored with costly spices from far-off lands, the common folk subsisted on a diet that was as monotonous as it was meager. But even the privileged were not immune to the perils of medieval food. The lavish feasts that were the hallmark of aristocratic life often came with a hidden cost. With no means of refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat, and many a noble fell ill or even died from consuming contaminated fare. The very excesses that were meant to showcase their wealth and status could prove to be their undoing. Such was the fate of King John of England, whose untimely death in 1216 was attributed to a surfeit of peaches. As the story goes, the king was traveling through the town of King's Lynn when he was seized by a terrible case of dysentery. Some say it was brought on by the rich food he had consumed at a nearby abbey, while others blamed the peaches he had eaten with relish. Whatever the cause, the king's condition quickly worsened, and he died a few days later, his reign cut short by a humble fruit. It is a testament to the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages that even the most powerful and privileged were not safe from the dangers that lurked in their food. For the vast majority of people, however, the risks were even greater. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, the temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too great to resist. This was especially true in times of dearth, when crops failed and food was scarce. During these lean years, people would resort to eating whatever they could find, even if it meant risking their health or even their lives. Acorns, grass, and other wild plants were often ground into a coarse flour to make bread, while animals that had died of disease were sometimes consumed out of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that would be unthinkable today. Unscrupulous bakers would stretch their dough with fillers like sawdust or chalk, while brewers would water down their ale to increase their profits. Such practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous, as they could lead to serious illness or even death. The alewife who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life, and one who often bore the brunt of the community's suspicions and resentments. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with noxious substances or even of practicing witchcraft. In a world where superstition held sway, the line between a bad batch of ale and a deadly poison was often blurred. Despite the many challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread, and pottage could be a moment of respite and togetherness. And for the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders would be further restricted. For 40 long days, they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and to draw closer to God. But for others, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was so often scarce and unpredictable, the idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed like the height of insanity. And yet, despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of the meager ingredients available to them, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is a reminder of how far we have come in terms of food safety, variety, and abundance, but also of how much we still have in common with our ancestors. For just as they struggle to put food on the table and to nourish their families, so too we grapple with the challenges of our own time, from climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life. As we sit down to our own meals, laden with a dizzying array of flavors and ingredients from all corners of the globe, it is easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that have brought us to this point. But by understanding the history of our food and the ways in which it has shaped our culture and our identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity that we enjoy today. So, the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us to this point, and give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who have toiled to put food on our tables, and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest of challenges. Perhaps, if a medieval peasant were to somehow be transported to a modern grocery store, they would be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from far-off lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of packaged and processed foods. But they might also feel a sense of unease, or even distrust, wondering at the hidden costs and compromises that have made such abundance possible. They might question the methods by which our food is grown and raised, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. In the end, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with the simple fare that has sustained them for generations. For while our modern food system may offer us greater choice and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own challenges and drawbacks. And just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what they had, to find joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, so too must we learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies but also our souls, that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and that leave a legacy of health and abundance for generations to come. So let us raise a toast to the humble peasant, the hard-working farmer, the skilled artisan, and all those who have labored to put food on our tables throughout history. Let us savor the flavors and textures of the foods we eat, not just as a source of sustenance, but as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. And let us never forget the power of food to bring us together, to nourish our bodies and our spirits, and to remind us of our shared humanity in the face of even the greatest of challenges. Asterisk, as we have observed, the medieval spice trade was a profitable yet dangerous enterprise. Those who managed the spice supply could accumulate vast wealth, while those who labored to transport these valuable goods to Europe risked their lives. One such spice merchant was a man named Giovanni da Marinoli. Born in the early 14th century, into a noble Florentine family, Giovanni appeared set for a life of comfort and leisure. However, a restless nature and a desire for adventure led him on a different course. In 1338, Giovanni embarked on a voyage that would span the known world, from the busy ports of Italy to the remote territories of China and India. As a papal representative and missionary, his official aim was to propagate the Christian faith. But Giovanni was also an astute businessman, constantly seeking valuable spices and other exotic items to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's journeys were filled with peril at every juncture. He traversed the expansive deserts of Central Asia, confronting sandstorms and highwaymen. He navigated treacherous mountain routes in the Himalayas, enduring altitude sickness and frostbite. He sailed the turbulent waters of the Indian Ocean, praying for survival through each monsoon season. Yet, despite all the difficulties he faced, Giovanni was also captivated by the marvels he encountered. He was amazed by the radiant white palaces of Khanbalik, the Mongol capital later known as Beijing. He respected the sincere piety of the Thomas Christians in southern India. He delighted in the potent aromas and tastes of the spice markets in Ceylon and Malabar. Throughout his travels, Giovanni collected a substantial shipment of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, meticulously packed in chests, to shield them from dampness during the lengthy return trip. He understood that if he could transport these spices safely back to Italy, he stood to earn a considerable fortune. However, Giovanni's good fortune was not to last. According to some narratives, his vessel was lost at sea during the return voyage, consigning him and his precious spices to the ocean depths. Other accounts suggest he survived the journey, only to be robbed and killed by bandits near Florence, his spices dispersed by the wind. Whatever the reality of his demise, Giovanni da Marinoli's story serves as a reminder of the extraordinary risks and rewards associated with the medieval spice trade. For a select few affluent merchants and fortunate adventurers, spices could be a pathway to immense wealth. But for most, like Giovanni, they remained an alluring dream, perpetually just beyond grasp. As we surrender to sleep, let us envision ourselves in a vibrant spice market in some distant part of the medieval world. The atmosphere is dense with the fragrance of pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and saffron. Merchants haggle in numerous languages, their voices ebbing and flowing like the ocean. We meander through the confined passageways, baskets in hand, admiring the vibrant heaps of spices from all corners of the earth. Here, a collection of ginger root, gnarled and sharp-smelling. There, a mound of cloves, resembling tiny brown nails, their scent warm and sugary. But as we fill our baskets, a sense of sorrow for the many who will never experience these tastes is unavoidable. For the impoverished peasants back in their homelands, a mere dash of pepper would be an unimaginable extravagance, let alone a fragrant curry or a spiced wine. Their nourishment, as we will investigate further, is a repetitive cycle of gruel and coarse fare, a stark contrast to the lavish banquets we have observed at the tables of the affluent. Yet even those opulent spreads, as we are soon to learn, could conceal their own hidden perils and revolting surprises. So, let us relish this imagined abundance, this uncommon sensory indulgence, as we drift into deeper slumber. For upon awakening, we will once more confront the harsh truths of food and the Middle Ages realities that rendered satisfying one's hunger a daily struggle for both royalty and commoners. The scarcity and hardship that characterized medieval food for the general populace also applied to the fundamental items that constituted the core of their diets. Bread, the most elementary and widespread food, was frequently a course unpalatable loaf that would be almost unrecognizable by today's standards. For poorer peasants, bread was crafted from inferior grains, such as barley, rye, and even beans or chestnuts when supplies were low. This produced dense, dark loaves that were challenging to digest and offered scant nutrition. The bread was often contaminated with gritty particles from inadequate milling processes, and it would rapidly become stale or moldy in the humid conditions of many peasant dwellings, even for peasants who were slightly better off and could afford wheat bread. The final product was far removed from the light, risen loaves we are accustomed to today. Leavening agents like yeast were costly and difficult to obtain, so most bread was unleavened flatbread, akin to modern pita. These flatbreads would be baked on a hearthstone or dried in the sun, leading to a hard cracker-like texture. The quality of bread was so significant that it was often indicative of social standing. The whitest, finest loaves, made from pure wheat flour, were reserved for the nobility, while the grayish-brown loaves of the peasantry were contemptuously called black bread. In some areas, stringent laws even forbade commoners from eating white bread, designating it a privilege of the elite. One prominent figure in the history of medieval bread production was the 12th century mystic, Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Born into a noble family in what is now Germany, Hildegard joined a monastery as a young girl and eventually became the abbess of her own community. In addition to her visionary spiritual writings and musical works, Hildegard was celebrated for her expertise in herbalism and natural healing. She wrote extensively on the characteristics of grains and the significance of proper nutrition, even at a time when such concepts were not widely grasped. In her work Physica, Hildegard identified spelt, an ancient grain closely related to wheat, as the optimal grain for human consumption. She believed that spelt bread nourished the body and promoted longevity, while warning against consuming raw cereals as detrimental to health. Hildegard applied her knowledge in practice, managing the substantial agricultural lands and bakery of her abbey. Under her direction, the nuns of Bingen produced high-quality spelt bread, which was given to the ill and impoverished in the local area. Although spelt remained a luxury item beyond the reach of most peasants, Hildegard's promotion of it as a healthier option to common wheat was remarkably forward-thinking. Modern nutritional science has supported many of her assertions, demonstrating that spelt is richer in protein and more easily digestible for many individuals than highly processed modern wheat. The life and work of Hildegard of Bingen offer insight into the pivotal role bread played in medieval society, not merely as a staple food, but as an emblem of social status and a potential instrument for healing. Her teachings, informed by a comprehensive understanding of the link between food and health, anticipated modern ideas about nutrition and well-being. Despite the contributions of visionaries like Hildegard, bread for most people in the Middle Ages continued to be a coarse, bland staple that was often in short supply. The unequal access to this fundamental necessity was yet another way. The stark class divisions of medieval society were evident in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the slight comfort of a consistent bread supply could be snatched away by the harsh turns of fortune and weather. In periods of drought, flood, or crop disease, when grain harvests failed, the dread of famine cast a large shadow over medieval communities. During these feared times of scarcity, food prices would soar while earnings dropped, leaving many peasants unable to purchase even basic sustenance, lacking any social support system. The most impoverished were left to starve or turn to desperate actions, such as consuming bark, grass, or, in the most severe instances, even resorting to cannibalism. One of the most devastating famines to affect medieval Europe was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. A disastrous combination of factors, including climate shifts, crop failures, and the economic repercussions of continuous wars, plunged the continent into a 7-year span of starvation and suffering. Contemporary chronicles vividly describe the suffering endured by the common people. Men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, recorded the Flemish monk William of Nanges. Some men, it was said, compelled by hunger, ate the bodies of executed criminals, and some poor people even ate their own children. The famine severely impacted the Low Countries and Scandinavia, with death rates reaching as high as 10 to 25% in certain areas. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of 16 deaths daily, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Even in the most favorable periods, the menace of hunger was never distant for medieval peasants. Their unstable existence, constantly dependent on the elements and the desires of their lords, meant that food insecurity was an ever-present reality. The grim truth of famine loomed large over the medieval world, a reminder of life's fragility in an era preceding modern agriculture and social welfare. It was a world where even the most fundamental necessity of bread could not be assured, and where the threat of starvation was always just one poor harvest away. As we proceed with our exploration of the culinary terrain of the Middle Ages, we will observe how this pervasive scarcity and insecurity influenced not only the diets but the entire worldview of medieval individuals. In a time when a satisfied stomach was a luxury and a stale piece of bread a treasure, food acquired a significance that is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective of abundance and choice. But first, let us direct our focus to another staple of the medieval diet that was hardly more appealing than the era's bread: meat, for all but the wealthiest nobles. Meat was an infrequent indulgence, reserved for special events, and when it did feature on the menu, it often appeared in forms that would repel modern diners. Lacking refrigeration, medieval people depended on various preservation methods to prevent meat from spoiling. Salting was the most prevalent technique, with heavily salted meats being a staple of winter diets. However, the salt itself was frequently of poor quality, laden with impurities that could impart a bad taste to the meat or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were also employed to preserve meats, especially in the form of sausages and hams. These could last for extended periods but would become hard and unappetizing over time, with a texture more like leather than the juicy, tender meats we are accustomed to today. For most peasants, meat typically meant tough, sinewy cuts from older animals that were no longer productive for milk or labor. Beef was rarely consumed by commoners, as cattle were simply too valuable to slaughter. Pork and poultry were somewhat more prevalent, but remained luxury items for most. The type and quantity of meat in medieval diets varied considerably by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people largely relied on freshwater fish rather than terrestrial meat. Hunting was a cherished privilege of the nobility, who jealously protected their exclusive rights to venison and other game meats. A vivid insight into the inequality of medieval meat consumption is found in the records of King Richard II's cooks in the late 14th century. For a single royal feast in 1387, the kitchens prepared 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 small pigs, a feast truly fit for a king. In contrast, a peasant family might expect to eat meat only a few times a year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the portions would be small and meticulously saved for months. But for one brief period in the history of medieval England, the ordinary peasantry experienced a taste of the abundance usually reserved for their superiors. Following the Black Death, which killed up to half the population in the mid-14th century, the massive labor shortage endowed surviving peasants with new negotiating power. With fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land, many peasants found themselves in the novel position of being able to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For a few short decades, the standard of living for English commoners improved significantly. Meat consumption increased as more peasants could afford to keep livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. Wages doubled, or even tripled, in some regions, allowing laboring families to supplement their usual fare of porridge and bread with the occasional chicken, pig, or even cow. However, this golden age for the peasantry was to be short-lived. The landed nobility, alarmed by the rising power of the lower classes, retaliated with laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind peasants to the land. The tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would culminate in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though the revolt was brutally suppressed. With its leaders executed and its gains largely reversed, it stands as a testament to the transformative impact of the Black Death on medieval society. For a brief, shining moment, the common people of England experienced a life less constrained by scarcity and toil. But for most of the Middle Ages, and for most people, meat remained a rare and coveted treat. For all but the wealthiest nobles, meat was an infrequent indulgence reserved for special events, and when it did feature on the menu, it often appeared in forms that would repel modern diners. Lacking refrigeration, medieval people depended on various preservation methods to prevent meat from spoiling. Salting was the most prevalent technique, with heavily salted meats being a staple of winter diets. However, the salt itself was frequently of poor quality, laden with impurities that could impart a bad taste to the meat or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were also employed to preserve meats, especially in the form of sausages and hams. These could last for extended periods but would become hard and unappetizing over time, with a texture more like leather than the juicy, tender meats we are accustomed to today. For most peasants, meat typically meant tough, sinewy cuts from older animals that were no longer productive for milk or labor. Beef was rarely consumed by commoners, as cattle were simply too valuable to slaughter. Pork and poultry were somewhat more prevalent but remained luxury items for most. The type and quantity of meat in medieval diets varied considerably by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people largely relied on freshwater fish rather than terrestrial meat. Hunting was a cherished privilege of the nobility, who jealously protected their exclusive rights to venison and other game meats. A vivid insight into the inequality of medieval meat consumption is found in the records of King Richard II's cooks in the late 14th century. For a single royal feast in 1387, the kitchens prepared 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 small pigs, a feast truly fit for a king. In contrast, a peasant family might expect to eat meat only a few times a year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the portions would be small and meticulously saved for months. But for one brief period in the history of medieval England, the ordinary peasantry experienced a taste of the abundance, usually reserved for their superiors. Following the Black Death, which killed up to half the population in the mid-14th century, the massive labor shortage endowed surviving peasants with new negotiating power. With fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land, many peasants found themselves in the novel position of being able to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For a few short decades, the standard of living for English commoners improved significantly. Meat consumption increased as more peasants could afford to keep livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. Wages doubled or even tripled in some regions, allowing laboring families to supplement their usual fare of porridge and bread with the occasional chicken, pig, or even cow. However, this golden age for the peasantry was to be short-lived. The landed nobility, alarmed by the rising power of the lower classes, retaliated with laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind peasants to the land. The tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would culminate in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though the revolt was brutally suppressed. With its leaders executed and its gains largely reversed, it stands as a testament to the transformative impact of the Black Death on medieval society. For a brief shining moment, the common people of England experienced a life less constrained by scarcity and toil. But for most of the Middle Ages, and for most people, meat remained a rare and coveted treat. Its scarcity made it a potent symbol of status and wealth, a tangible reminder of the chasm between the haves and have-nots. In the great halls of castles and manors, nobles and knights feasted on heaping platters of roasted game and delicate fowl, washing it down with fine wines and honeyed mead. But in the hovels of the peasantry, a scrap of salted pork or a stringy chicken leg was a hard-won delicacy to be savored and stretched as far as it could go. This disparity in access to such a basic foodstuff underscores the harsh inequalities that defined life in the Middle Ages. In a world where even a full belly was a mark of privilege, the gulf between rich and poor was as wide as the distance between a king's banquet table and a peasant's empty trencher. As we have observed, the infrequent piece of meat was a highlight in the otherwise dull and repetitive diet of most medieval individuals. Yet even this minor enjoyment was subject to strict control by the authority of the Church. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church held enormous sway over every facet of daily existence, and food was no different. The church calendar was filled with fast days and meatless days when the eating of animal products was strictly forbidden. The most notable of these was the Lenten season, the 40-day interval preceding Easter. During this period, all meat, dairy, and eggs were prohibited, compelling believers to survive on a scant diet of fish, vegetables, and bread. For affluent nobles, this was a slight disruption. They could manage to import exotic fruits, nuts, and spices to enhance their Lenten meals, and their well-supplied fish ponds guaranteed a consistent provision of fresh seafood. But for the impoverished, Lent signified an even more limited and monotonous diet than usual. The Church's justification for these dietary limitations was based on the concepts of penance and spiritual discipline. By abstaining from the pleasures of the body, even in the form of food, believers were believed to be cleansing their souls and aligning themselves with Christ's suffering. However, in a world where hunger and scarcity were daily realities for most people, the notion of voluntary self-denial must have seemed a cruel irony. For peasants who seldom tasted meat in any case, the enforcement of further restrictions could feel like a harsh joke. Nevertheless, the Church's power was so immense that few dared to openly disregard its dietary commands. To do so was to risk not only social exclusion but also the very real prospect of eternal damnation. In an era when the afterlife was considered more tangible and significant than earthly existence, this was a powerful deterrent indeed. A poignant account illustrating the difficulties of Lenten fasting comes from the records of a 14th century English manor. In 1322, a peasant woman named Agnes Paston was brought before the manorial court accused of stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. In her defense, Agnes claimed she had stolen the bread to feed her starving children, who were too young to comprehend the rules of the fast. She implored for mercy, asserting that God surely would not wish her innocent children to go hungry. The court, affected by her plea, took the exceptional step of acquitting Agnes of the theft charge. However, they still cautioned her for violating the Lenten fast, reminding her that the needs of the soul must supersede the desires of the body. For Agnes and innumerable others like her, the strict dietary rules of the Church must have appeared as just another encumbrance in a life already characterized by hardship and hunger. In a world where food was scarce and survival uncertain, the idea of willingly renouncing what little sustenance was available must have been difficult to accept. Yet, the Church's influence on medieval food culture was not entirely detrimental. Monasteries and abbeys were often leaders in agricultural advancement, introducing new methods for crop rotation, irrigation, and selective breeding. They also functioned as storehouses of classical knowledge concerning agriculture and food preservation, keeping alive the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece. Furthermore, the Church played a crucial role in supplying food aid to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were known for their charitable distribution of bread and ale to the needy, and many ran hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick and destitute. In a time before social welfare programs or organized charity, the Church was often the sole safety net for the most vulnerable members of society. Its teachings about the virtues of charity and the sin of gluttony helped too. establish a moral obligation for those with resources to share their abundance with the less fortunate. Of course, this charity was often intertwined with a significant measure of paternalism and moral condemnation. The poor were expected to be thankful for whatever meager provisions they received, and to accept their station in life as divinely ordained. But for those on the verge of starvation, even a small act of kindness could signify the difference between life and death. As the Middle Ages progressed, the culinary disparity between the affluent and the impoverished only widened. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was experiencing what some historians term the Little Ice Age, a period of colder temperatures and frequent climatic disturbances. Crop yields fell as fields were ravaged by droughts, floods, and unseasonal frosts. Food prices soared, leaving many commoners unable to afford even basic staples. Simultaneously, the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks had decimated the population, leading to labor shortages and increased wages. In reaction, the nobility and the rising merchant class intensified conspicuous consumption as a means of displaying their wealth and status. Lavish banquets featuring exotic dishes and opulent presentations of sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks became commonplace. Meanwhile, the poor were left to survive on whatever meager provisions they could find. In times of dearth, many were forced to eat famine bread, made from a desperate combination of peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. Others resorted to foraging for wild plants or hunting any animals they could capture, from rodents to crows. Yet, even amidst this stark inequality, there were glimmers of hope and resistance. Peasant revolts, such as the English Rising of 1381, or the German Peasants' War of the early 16th century, saw the common people rising up to demand better treatment and a more equitable share of the wealth. While these uprisings were often brutally suppressed, they nevertheless attested to the unyielding human spirit and the enduring dream of a world where everyone could enjoy the basic dignity of a full stomach and a decent life. And in the kitchens and gardens of ordinary people, the seeds of a more vibrant and diverse food culture were being sown. Women, who bore the primary responsibility for feeding their families, were the unsung heroes of medieval cuisine. With creativity and resourcefulness, they found ways to coax flavor and nourishment out of even the humblest ingredients. In the folk traditions of pickling, preserving, and foraging, they passed down knowledge that would sustain their communities through lean times and lay the foundation for the culinary revolutions to come. And in the communal ovens and shared meals of village life, they nurtured a spirit of solidarity and resilience that would prove as sustaining as any loaf of bread. So, while the story of food in the Middle Ages is undoubtedly one of hardship and deprivation, it is also a story of ingenuity, resilience, and hope. In the face of scarcity and oppression, medieval people found ways to nourish not just their bodies, but their spirits, to find joy and communion in the simple act of sharing a meal. As we look back on this distant and often difficult past, we can take inspiration from their example. In a world that is still riven by inequality and hunger, their story reminds us of the fundamental human right to food and the vital importance of fighting for a more just and sustainable food system. And in our own kitchens and around our own tables, we can honor their legacy by cherishing the abundance we enjoy and remembering always to share it with those who have less. For in the end, the true measure of a society is not in the opulence of its feasts. As we have seen, for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, food was a daily struggle of scarcity, monotony, and even danger. But there was one place where the food was always abundant, always varied, and always exquisite: the royal court. While peasants subsisted on gruel and stale bread, nobles feasted on the finest delicacies the land had to offer. Imagine being the royal cook, entrusted with the monumental task of preparing lavish meals for the king and his court. Your day begins before dawn as you oversee the delivery of ingredients from far and wide. Wagons roll into the castle courtyard laden with barrels of wine from Burgundy, wheels of cheese from the Alps, crates of spices from the Orient. The king's huntsmen ride in with deer and boar slung over their saddles, ready to be transformed into savory roasts and pies. In the cavernous castle kitchens, a small army of servants bustles about under your command. Fires roar in the great hearths as spits turn slowly, roasting meats to perfection. Cauldrons bubble with fragrant stews and soups, while bakers knead dough for bread and pastries. The air is thick with the aroma of exotic spices: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, each worth more than their weight in silver. As the hour of the feast approaches, you put the finishing touches on your creations: a magnificent roast swan, its plumed neck curving gracefully on the platter, a gleaming aspic studded with gems of fruit and topped with gold leaf, a towering subtlety in the shape of the king's coat of arms, painted in vibrant hues. Each dish is a work of art, crafted to delight the eye as much as the palate. When, at last, the noble guests file into the great hall and take their seats, it is time for your masterpieces to be unveiled. Servants parade the platters in, presenting each to the high table with a flourish. The guests ooh and ah as they are served, marveling at the bounty before them. For a few glorious hours, they dine like gods, sampling delicacies from every corner of the known world. But even here, in the rarefied realm of the royal court, the specter of illness lurks behind the splendor. For all their expense and artistry, even the most sumptuous dishes can harbor deadly spoilage, and the sheer excess of the feast often leads to overindulgence, as nobles gorge themselves far past the point of satisfaction. It is not unheard of for a courtier to literally eat himself to death, felled by his own gluttony. So, while the royal feast may stand in stark contrast to the meager rations of the common folk, it is not without its own perils. In a world without refrigeration or food safety standards, no one is truly safe from the dangers of the dining table. Rich or poor, the medieval relationship with food is always a precarious one. Today, we can scarcely imagine the hardships that our ancestors endured simply to fill their bellies. The poorest among us have access to a variety and quality of food that would have been unthinkable even for medieval kings. We can walk into a gleaming supermarket and find fruits and vegetables from every season, meats and cheeses from every continent, spices and sauces from every cuisine. We can eat what we want, when we want, without fear of famine or food poisoning. But perhaps in our abundance, we have lost something as well. The medieval peasant, for all his suffering, likely felt a deep connection to the land and the turning of the seasons. He knew intimately the sweat and toil that went into every mouthful. While we may pity him, his limited options, he would likely look upon our prepackaged, mass-produced meals with a mixture of wonder and horror. One can imagine a medieval serf transported to the snack aisle of a modern grocery store, marveling at the colorful bags and boxes stretching out before him. He picks up a shiny packet, turning it over in his weathered hands. Cheetos, he reads slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar word. Made with real cheese. He shakes his head in disbelief. Real cheese, for a mere peasant. Impossible. He puts it back on the shelf and moves on, overwhelmed by the strange bounty of this new world. As we drift off to sleep, bellies full of whatever we desire, let us take a moment to reflect on the privilege of choice. Let us remember the countless generations who came before, who fought and scraped and starved, so that we might have the luxury of a full larder. And let us be grateful for the simple, everyday miracle of enough to eat. As the sun descended over the active port city of Venice, a fatigued spice merchant named Luca stepped off his vessel, his valuable shipment of exotic spices from the east held securely in his bag. Luca had devoted months to navigating the dangerous Silk Road, confronting bandits, sandstorms, and intense heat to deliver a taste of distant lands to the tables of prosperous Europeans. For Luca and merchants akin to him, the spice trade was a profitable yet hazardous undertaking. The desire for spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron was immense among the aristocracy, who utilized them to season their elaborate dishes and display their wealth. However, for the ordinary populace, these fragrant flavorings remained an unobtainable extravagance, their meals sadly bland and uninviting. As Luca traversed the meandering canals of Venice to bring his goods to his affluent customers, he could not help but contemplate the stark disparity between the sumptuous feasts of the wealthy and the scant provisions of the poor. While nobles indulged in succulent roasts seasoned with exotic spices, peasants survived on little more than coarse bread and watery porridge, their palates never experiencing the vibrant zest of pepper or the warm, sweet essence of cinnamon. The existence of a spice merchant was characterized by constant travel and peril, with fortunes made and lost based on the whims of the sea and the shifting desert sands. Luca had encountered his share of difficulties on his voyages: attacks by plundering bandits, treacherous mountain routes, and the ever-present danger of disease. Yet he persevered, motivated by the prospect of wealth and the excitement of the unknown. As he completed his final deliveries and tallied his earnings, Luca could not dismiss the sensation that, despite all the affluence and esteem the spice trade afforded him, it served as a poignant reminder of the profound inequalities that afflicted medieval society. While he dined on saffron-infused stews and fragrant spiced wines, the common people retired with rumbling stomachs, their dreams disturbed by the alluring scents emanating from the kitchens of the elite. With a somber heart, Luca withdrew to his luxurious villa for the night, aware that the following day he would once again embark for remote lands, pursuing the promise of fortune and abandoning a world where the simple delight of a flavorful meal remained an elusive dream for most. As the initial light of morning appeared over the horizon, a weary housewife named Matilda awoke from her rest, her thoughts already occupied with the numerous chores that awaited her. For Matilda and innumerable other women throughout medieval Europe, the onset of autumn signified not a period of plentiful harvests and joyful celebrations, but rather a time of relentless work and gnawing concern about the approaching threat of winter, with the days becoming shorter and the nights growing colder. Matilda understood she had very little time to preserve the meager crops her family had managed to cultivate from the stubborn soil. Every bit of food was invaluable, and nothing could be permitted to spoil, lest they confront the dreadful possibility of starvation in the harsh months to lay ahead. As she commenced her tasks, Matilda's thoughts drifted to the extravagant feasts of the nobility, where magnificent meats and exotic delicacies were consumed with thoughtless abandon. For her and her fellow peasants, such luxuries were little more than cruel jests, taunting reminders of the immense divide that separated the haves from the have-nots in the rigid social structure of medieval society. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda labored from dawn till dusk, salting and smoking the small amount of meat they had managed to raise, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar, and hanging herbs to dry from the rafters. The work was repetitive and exhausting, but she could not afford to stop, knowing that every morsel she preserved now could mean the difference between life and death when winter arrived. As the days passed and the leaves began to change color, Matilda's thoughts turned to the harsh realities that were imminent. Even with all her diligent effort, she knew that winter would be a period of scarcity and hardship, with meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel. Day after day, the specter of hunger was a constant presence, lurking just beyond the doorway, waiting to seize the vulnerable and the weak with its icy grip. Yet, even when faced with such bleak prospects, Matilda found solace in the knowledge that her tireless efforts would at least provide her family with a chance to survive. With a fierce determination alight in her heart, she continued her labors, her hands raw and her spirit fatigued, but her resolve unyielding. For in a world where famine and privation were constant threats, the simple act of preserving food was an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to yield to the unyielding cruelty of fate. As the first snowflakes began to fall and the cold winds of winter swept across the land. Matilda could only pray that her labors had been sufficient. With a heavy heart and an empty larder, she prepared to face the long, dark months ahead, knowing that for her and countless others like her, the struggle for survival was only just beginning. In a magnificent castle, situated amidst rolling hills and lush forests, a grand feast was in progress. The great hall resonated with boisterous laughter and the clinking of goblets as nobles from distant lands assembled to enjoy an extravagant exhibition of wealth and authority. At the table's head sat the lord of the manor, his jeweled fingers tearing into a succulent roasted swan, its delicate meat seasoned with exotic spices from faraway regions. All around him, the tables groaned under the weight of innumerable delicacies, savory meat pies, rich stews, and decadent pastries, each a testament to the expertise of the castle's master chefs. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting meats and the heavy scent of mulled wine, a sensory delight that stood in stark contrast to the meager rations of the serfs laboring in the fields beyond the castle walls. For these humble peasants, the very idea of such a feast was little more than a cruel fantasy, a tantalizing glimpse of a world forever beyond their grasp. As they huddled in their drafty hovels, their bellies gnawing with hunger, they could only dream of the rich flavors and sumptuous textures that graced the tables of their superiors. Their own meals, if they could even be called that, consisted of little more than a thin gruel made from whatever scraps and leftovers they could scrounge together. A few fortunate ones might have a meager crust of bread to gnaw on, but for most, even that was a rare luxury. The thought of meat, let alone the succulent delicacies being devoured by the nobles, was little more than a distant fantasy. As the feast wore on and the wine flowed freely, the nobles grew ever more boisterous, their laughter ringing through the halls and echoing off the stone walls. They traded bawdy jokes and tales of their exploits, their faces flushed with the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of their overindulged appetites. But beyond the castle walls, the serfs huddled in their misery, their stomachs cramping with hunger and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would likely never know the pleasures of a full belly or a contented smile. For them, life was little more than an endless cycle of back-breaking labor and gnawing hunger, the cruel whims of fate forever conspiring to keep them in their place. As the last embers of the feast's great fires died out and the nobles retired to their plush chambers, the serfs returned to their own meager dwellings, their minds haunted by the tantalizing aromas and raucous laughter that had filled the night air. With heavy hearts and empty stomachs, they settled in for another long, cold night, the specter of hunger their constant companion, and the dream of a better life little more than a cruel, taunting mirage. In the bustling streets of a medieval town, an alewife named Agnes hurried to and fro, her arms laden with jugs of her latest brew. Agnes was a stout, no-nonsense woman who had been brewing ale for as long as anyone could remember. It was a hard life, fraught with long hours and meager profits, but it was the only life she had ever known. As she made her way through the winding alleys, dodging the refuse and filth that littered the streets, Agnes couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt over the shortcut she had taken with her latest batch. Times were tough, and the price of grain had skyrocketed, leaving her with little choice but to stretch her ale with a bit of extra water. It was a risky move, one that could land her in hot water with the local authorities if anyone found out. But what choice did she have? Agnes knew that her customers, mostly hard-working laborers and craftsmen, relied on her ale to provide a brief respite from the drudgery of their daily lives. They craved the rich, hearty flavor and the pleasant buzz that came with a few pints after a long day's work, but with the cost of ingredients eating into her already meager profits, Agnes had been forced to cut corners wherever she could. As she arrived at the tavern and began to unload her wares, Agnes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was betraying her customers' trust. She took pride in her craft, and the thought of serving them watered-down swill made her stomach churn. But what choice did she have? It was either adulterate her brew or risk losing everything she had worked so hard to build. With a heavy heart, Agnes began to serve her customers, watching as they eagerly quaffed down the subpar ale, their faces contorting in disappointment as they realized that something was amiss. Some grumbled under their breath, while others outright complained, demanding to know what had happened to the usually stellar brew. Agnes did her best to deflect their questions and assuage their concerns, but the guilt continued to gnaw at her. She knew that her actions were wrong, but in a world where survival was a daily struggle, sometimes compromises had to be made. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Agnes finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She surveyed the empty jugs and the meager pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harsh realities of her trade. With a weary sigh, she began to clean up, her mind already racing with worries about how she would make ends meet in the days to come. For Agnes and countless other alewives like her, the struggle to survive in a world of scarcity and hardship was a constant battle. Each day brought new challenges and difficult choices, and the line between right and wrong often blurred in the face of desperation. But still they persevered, driven by the hope that someday, somehow, their hard work and sacrifice would pay off, and they would finally know the taste of a better life in the grand halls of a medieval palace. A royal cook named Guillaume scurried about the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he oversaw the preparations for the evening's lavish feast. Guillaume was a master of his craft, renowned throughout the land for his ability to create culinary masterpieces that dazzled the senses and left even the most discerning palates in awe. As he moved from station to station, barking orders and sampling sauces, Guillaume couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the opulence and extravagance that surrounded him. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with scullery maids and kitchen boys scurrying to and fro, their arms laden with the finest ingredients from across the realm. There were plump capons and succulent roasts, their skins glistening with honey and spices, mountains of fresh fruits and vegetables, their colors so vibrant they seemed to leap off the platters, and delicate pastries and confections, each one a work of art in its own right. It was a true testament to the wealth and power of the royal court, and Guillaume reveled in his role as the mastermind behind it all. But even as he basked in the glory of his creations, Guillaume couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew all too well the stark contrast between the lavish feasts he prepared for the nobility and the meager scraps that passed for meals among the common folk. It was a divide that troubled him deeply, though he knew that to speak out against it would be to risk everything he had worked so hard to achieve. As the final preparations were made and the first course was served, Guillaume watched from the shadows as the nobles took their seats, their faces alight with anticipation. He saw the way their eyes widened in delight as they tasted his creations, the appreciative murmurs and nods of approval that rippled through the crowd. For a moment he allowed himself to bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. But as the night wore on and the revelry grew more boisterous, Guillaume couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that tugged at his heart. He thought of the countless, hungry mouths beyond the palace walls, the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of those who had never known the pleasure of a full belly. As the last of the dishes were cleared away and the nobles retired to their chambers, their stomachs groaning with the excesses of the feast, Guillaume finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He slumped against the kitchen wall, his eyes closed, and his heart heavy with the weight of the injustices he had witnessed. In that moment, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in a world where food was not a privilege reserved for the few, but a basic right afforded to all. He knew that such a world was little more than a dream, a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the stars themselves. But still, he couldn't help but hope that someday, somehow, things might change, and the plenty he created in the palace kitchens might find its way to those who needed it most. Until then, Guillaume knew that he would continue to ply his trade, his hands forever stained with the guilt of the plenty he created and the poverty he helped perpetuate. It was a burden he would carry with him always, a constant reminder of the cruelty and inequality that lay at the heart of the medieval world. As we have journeyed through the annals of medieval history, exploring the harsh realities and cruel inequities that defined the era's food culture, it is impossible not to feel a sense of gratitude for the relative abundance and variety that we enjoy in the modern age. The struggles and hardships faced by our ancestors, from the lowliest serf to the most skilled artisan, serve as a poignant reminder of just how far we have come in our quest to ensure that all people have access to the basic necessities of life. But even as we celebrate the progress we have made, it is important to remember that the specter of hunger and malnutrition still looms large in many parts of the world. Even in the midst of plenty, there are still those who go to bed with empty stomachs and aching hearts, their dreams haunted by the same cruel inequalities that plagued the medieval world. As we reflect on the lessons of the past and the challenges of the present, it is clear that the fight for food justice is one that is far from over. It is a struggle that will require the collective efforts of all those who believe in the basic human right to nourishment and sustenance. A struggle that will test our resolve and our compassion in equal measure. But even in the face of such daunting odds, we must never lose sight of the progress we have made and the hope that sustains us. We must draw strength from the courage and resilience of those who came before us, those who toiled in the fields and labored in the kitchens, their hands calloused and their hearts heavy with the weight of their burdens. And we must continue to push forward, to fight for a world in which no one goes hungry and in which the bounty of the earth is shared equally among all those who call it home. It is a vision that may seem distant and unattainable, a dream as fragile and fleeting as the wisps of steam rising from a bowl of gruel. But it is a dream worth fighting for, a dream that has the power to transform the world and bring hope to the hearts of all those who hunger for a better tomorrow. So let us go forth with renewed purpose and determination. Armed with the knowledge of the past and the hope of the future, let us work to build a world in which the plenty of the palace kitchens finds its way to the bellies of the poor, and in which the joys of the harvest are shared by all those who have labored to bring it to fruition. For in the end, the struggle for food justice is not just about filling stomachs and sating hunger. It is about the very essence of what it means to be human, about the bonds of compassion and empathy that bind us all together across the gulfs of time and space. It is a struggle that will require all of our strength and all of our courage, but it is a struggle that we cannot afford to lose. So let us go forth with open hearts and willing hands, ready to do our part in the great work of building a world in which all people can know the simple joy of a full belly and a contented smile. For in that world, the legacy of the medieval food culture will not be one of scarcity and deprivation, but one of abundance and hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of times. Naturally, for the peasants laboring in the fields from sunrise to sunset, such luxury was beyond imagination. They survived on the most inadequate meals, their stomachs never truly satisfied. A common repast might involve a thin barley or rye gruel called pottage, served with a piece of dense, coarse bread. If they were lucky, they might have a small bit of hard cheese or a few withered peas to add some nourishment. Meat was an uncommon treat, perhaps a small portion of tough, stringy salted pork for a special event like Christmas or Easter. The peasant diet's lack of diversity was remarkable. While the aristocracy feasted on delicacies from remote lands, the common people relied on the same bland staples day after day. There was little to alleviate the monotony except for the changing seasons, which determined what meager produce might be accessible. In spring, tender greens such as nettles or dandelions could offer a welcome change from the usual fare. By summer, a few precious fruits, small, hard apples, or bitter crab apples might be collected from the forests. Autumn brought the harvest, a period of arduous labor, but also a brief period of abundant fresh grains, and perhaps a slaughtered pig or two to preserve as salt meat for the lengthy winter. Winter, the leanest and most feared season for the medieval peasant, As days shortened and nights turned bitterly cold, families gathered around smoky hearths, their stomachs aching with hunger. Whatever little food remained from the harvest had to be carefully rationed, distributed in small amounts to last until spring. This was when the pottage became thinner and more watery, the bread even harder and more difficult to chew. Starvation was an ever-present threat, ready to claim the weak and vulnerable. It is challenging for us to conceive of such an unstable existence, where a single failed crop could mean disaster for an entire village. Yet, for most people in the Middle Ages, this was the harsh reality of everyday life. They existed at the mercy of the elements, the nobility, and the often cruel turns of fate. A mouth to feed was as much a burden as a blessing, another empty stomach to fill from scarce resources. Even those slightly higher on the social scale, like skilled artisans or prosperous freemen, seldom enjoyed much better food than their poorer neighbors. A bowl of pottage might be enhanced with a bit of valuable butter or a scrap of meat, but the fundamental monotony persisted. The same could be said for the monks in their abbeys and monasteries. While they generally ate better than the laity, subsisting on bread, cheese, fish, and ale, their diet was still quite austere by modern standards. Rich spices and exotic ingredients were reserved for the tables of the nobility. Regarding ale, it was the common beverage of the Middle Ages, consumed by people of all ages. Clean drinking water was often scarce, and the fermentation process offered some protection against waterborne illnesses. But even this small comfort could be adulterated by unscrupulous brewers extending their product with unsavory additives. Dishonest bakers might do likewise with bread, mixing precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, or even sawdust and chalk. Such deceptions were officially condemned and could be severely punished if discovered, but the desperate realities of the time made them all too frequent. This was a world where food was a daily struggle, a relentless cycle of toil and hunger for all but a privileged few. The nobles in their grand halls, dining on elaborately prepared dishes and fine wines, seemed to inhabit an entirely different realm of existence from the grimy, half-starved peasants working their lands. It was a stark divide, one that fostered resentment and sometimes open rebellion. But more often, it fostered a kind of grim resignation and acceptance that this was simply how things were. A peasant's destiny was to suffer and endure, to eke out a meager living from an unforgiving land and hope for a better life in the hereafter. Yet, even amidst such hardship, there were brief moments of respite and festivity. Holidays and feast days offered fleeting glimpses of abundance, when even the poorest might enjoy a bit of meat or a sweet pastry. Weddings, baptisms, and other significant events were celebrated with communal meals, providing an opportunity for neighbors to gather and share what little they possessed. These transient moments of fellowship made the difficult times more tolerable, a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, the human spirit could persevere. And persevere they did, these resilient medieval individuals. They bore their difficulties with a stoicism and resolve that is hard to comprehend from our modern perspective. They confronted each day with grim determination, aware that survival depended on their own diligent effort and resourcefulness. In a world where starvation perpetually lurked nearby, there was no place for idleness or self-pity. Perhaps that is why tales of grand feasts and fantastical foods were so popular in medieval culture. In a society where hunger was the standard, stories of tables laden with succulent meats, fresh fruits, and sweet delicacies provided a tantalizing escape from reality. Myths and legends often depicted magical cauldrons that never emptied or enchanted lands, where no one ever experienced hunger. These imaginative tales expressed a profound, unquenchable desire for plenty in a world characterized by scarcity. But while the medieval peasant might dream of such marvels, their daily existence remained one of relentless hardship. The threat of famine was never distant, poised to strike at the first indication of blight or drought. And even in prosperous times, the diet of the common folk was woefully insufficient by modern nutritional standards. Predominantly grains and lacking in almost everything else, it left much of the population malnourished and vulnerable to disease. This chronic malnutrition had widespread consequences for medieval society. It impeded growth, weakened immune systems, and rendered childbirth even more hazardous than it already was. It diminished strength and vitality, leaving peasants ill-equipped to manage the arduous labor that was their fate. And it contributed to the general atmosphere of misery and desperation that pervaded so much of the medieval world like a shroud. Yet, despite everything, life continued. Crops were sown and reaped, babies were born and nurtured, and the great cycle of existence persisted. The medieval peasant may not have possessed many material comforts, but they had their faith, their family, and their community to support them. They found happiness where they could, in the simple joys of a warm fire on a cold evening or a full stomach after the harvest celebration. And they endured season after harsh season with a resilience and fortitude that is difficult not to respect. So, the next occasion you enjoy a meal, pause to appreciate the incredible variety and abundance at your disposal. Consider your medieval ancestors who lived and died by the vagaries of the harvest, and be thankful for the centuries of progress and plenty that distinguish us from those grim, hungry times. Because while the medieval peasant might have dreamed of a magical land of endless feasts, we are fortunate enough to live in a world where that dream is tantalizingly close to reality, and that is a privilege we should never underestimate. The predicament of the medieval peasant was further exacerbated by the imbalanced nature of their diets. While the nobility indulged in a wide array of meats, fruits, and vegetables, the average serf survived on meager fare dominated by grains. Porridge, gruel, and coarse bread formed the mainstay of their sustenance, augmented by whatever small scraps they could procure from their labor. A typical peasant family might consider themselves fortunate to own a cow, a pig, or a small flock of chickens. However, the milk, eggs, and meat these animals yielded were infrequent treats, reserved for special occasions or times of extreme need. More often than not, any surplus was sold or given as rent to their feudal lord, leaving little for the family's own consumption. Envision, if you will, the stark disparity between a noble's extravagant feast and a serf's humble meal. In the grand hall of the castle, tables strain under the weight of roasted meats, savory pies, exotic fruits, and fine cheeses. The air is filled with the scent of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves as richly dressed lords and ladies dine with enthusiasm. Meanwhile, in the confined hovel of a peasant family, a pot of thin gruel simmers over the fire. The mother carefully distributes the meager serving, ensuring each family member receives just enough to quell the gnawing hunger in their stomachs. The children's eyes widen at the sight of a small piece of bread, a precious addition to their usual fare. The unbalanced nature of the peasant diet exacted a heavy toll on their health. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening the immune system and leaving the population susceptible to disease. Scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, was a common ailment, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if not treated. In times of famine, known as seasons of dearth, the situation became even more critical. Crop failures due to drought, flooding, or pests could spell disaster for entire regions. With no reserves to rely on, peasant families were left to starve, their weakened bodies succumbing to hunger and disease. One particularly distressing account comes from the chronicler Henry of Livonia, who described a famine in the early 13th century. He wrote of peasants driven to such desperation that they resorted to eating dogs, cats, and even the corpses of the dead. While such extreme measures were rare, they serve as a grim reminder of the precarious nature of life for the medieval peasantry. The unequal distribution of food in medieval society was a stark reflection of the rigid class hierarchy that defined the era. While the nobility enjoyed a varied and plentiful diet, the vast majority of the population lived on the brink of starvation. Their meals a monotonous and meager affair. This disparity would persist for centuries, with only gradual improvements in agricultural techniques and social reforms slowly narrowing the gap as we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages. We turn our attention to another scourge that plagued the populace: adulterated food and drink. In a time before strict regulations and quality control, unscrupulous merchants and producers often resorted to cutting corners and deceiving their customers in the name of profit. One common target for adulteration was bread, a staple of the medieval diet. Bakers seeking to stretch their meager supplies of flour would mix in a variety of unsavory additives. Ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, and even ground bones were among the fillers used to bulk up the loaves. The resulting bread was often dense, gritty, and lacking in both flavor and nutrition. Ale and wine, the favored drinks of the era, were also subject to tampering. In a time when clean drinking water was often scarce, these fermented beverages were seen as a safer alternative. However, unscrupulous brewers and vintners would often water down their products to increase their profits, resulting in weak, insipid drinks that did little to quench the thirst or lift the spirits. The story of Agnes, the alewife, illustrates the temptation to adulterate one's wares. Agnes, a widow struggling to make ends meet, relied on the meager profits from her small brewing operation to support herself and her children. One particularly lean year, with the price of grains soaring and her customers dwindling, Agnes made the fateful decision to water down her ale, stretching her limited supply to sell more volume. At first, her deception went unnoticed, and Agnes breathed a sigh of relief as the coins clinked into her purse. However, word soon spread of the weak, tasteless brew, and her once loyal customers began to seek out other alehouses. Agnes's reputation was ruined, and she was forced to close her doors, leaving her family to face an uncertain future. While medieval authorities did attempt to regulate the quality of food and drink, enforcement was often lax and inconsistent. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th century English law, set strict standards for the weight and price of these staples. But bakers and brewers found creative ways to skirt the rules. Fines and public humiliation were common punishments for those caught adulterating their products. But the lure of easy profits often outweighed the risk of getting caught. The prevalence of adulterated food and drink in medieval society added yet another layer of misery to the already challenging lives of the common people. Not only were their diets monotonous and nutritionally deficient, but they also had to contend with the constant threat of being cheated or sickened by unscrupulous producers. It was a harsh reminder of the powerlessness of the masses in the face of a system stacked against them. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, it becomes increasingly clear that the romantic image of a bountiful, rustic past is a far cry from the truth. For the vast majority of the population, eating was a daily struggle fraught with scarcity, monotony, and the ever-present specter of adulteration. In a world where food was quite literally a matter of life and death, the medieval peasant had little choice but to make do with whatever meager sustenance they could scrape together. But the challenges of medieval dining were not limited to the quality and quantity of the food itself. The very environment in which people ate was often a source of discomfort and even danger. In our next chapter, we will explore the unsanitary conditions that plagued the medieval world and how they contributed to the overall misery of the era's culinary landscape. Picture, if you will, a typical peasant dwelling in the Middle Ages. The small, cramped space is shared not only by the human occupants, but also by a menagerie of livestock. Chickens peck at the dirt floor, while a pig roots in the corner, seeking out any stray scraps of food. The air is thick with the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and wood smoke. In such close quarters, the line between living space and barnyard was often blurred. Livestock were kept indoors, not only for their own safety but also for the warmth they provided during the cold winter months. However, This practice came at a steep price in terms of sanitation and hygiene. Animal waste combined with the general lack of cleanliness created a breeding ground for disease. Flies buzzed incessantly, spreading filth and contamination from one surface to another. The very food that the peasants relied on for survival was often tainted by the unsanitary conditions in which it was prepared and consumed. The consequences of this lack of hygiene were dire. Digestive ailments, parasitic infections, and food poisoning were common occurrences, sapping the strength and vitality of the population. Even the highest echelons of society were not immune to the dangers of contaminated food, as the story of King John of England illustrates. In the year 1216, King John was on the move, campaigning against rebel barons who sought to limit his power. During a stay at the town of Lynn, he indulged in a feast of peaches, a rare treat for the time. However, unbeknownst to the king, the peaches had been improperly stored and had begun to rot. Consumed by hunger and a love of exotic fruits, John ate his fill, only to fall violently ill shortly thereafter. Racked by dysentery and fever, the king's health rapidly deteriorated. He pressed on with his campaign, but his weakened state left him vulnerable to the elements. Crossing the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash, John's baggage train was lost to the rising waters, taking with it his crown jewels and other treasures. The king himself narrowly escaped with his life, but his days were numbered. Less than 2 weeks later, he succumbed to his illness, his reign cut short by a simple meal of tainted fruit. King John's fate, while perhaps more dramatic than most, was not uncommon in a world where food safety was a rare luxury. The medieval landscape was a veritable minefield of potential hazards, from spoiled meat to contaminated water sources. Even the air itself could be a source of danger, as the miasma theory of disease held sway. According to this belief, foul odors and bad air were the primary culprits behind the spread of illness. Medieval cities, with their narrow winding streets and piles of festering garbage, were seen as particularly noxious environments. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and industrial pollution mingled together in a miasmatic brew that was believed to be the source of all manner of ailments. In reality, of course, it was the unsanitary conditions themselves that allowed disease to thrive. The Black Death, which wiped out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, was spread not by bad air, but by fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The crowded, filthy conditions of medieval cities provided an ideal environment for the disease to take hold and spread like wildfire. The impact of unsanitary conditions on medieval food culture cannot be overstated. It was not merely a matter of unpleasant odors and occasional bouts of illness, but a pervasive and deadly threat that loomed over every meal. The simple act of eating, which we today take for granted as a pleasurable and nourishing experience, was fraught with danger and uncertainty for the average medieval peasant. In a world where even the most basic standards of hygiene were often lacking, food became not just a source of sustenance, but also a potential vector for disease and suffering. This, combined with the scarcity and monotony of the peasant diet, created a culinary landscape that was as bleak as it was unappetizing. As we continue our exploration of why food in medieval times sucked, it is important to remember that the challenges we have discussed so far, the lack of variety, the difficulty of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions, were not the only factors at play. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to the role of the Church in shaping the culinary habits of the time, and how religious doctrine often compounded the already considerable hardships faced by the average medieval diner. But first, let us take a moment to reflect on the incredible resilience and adaptability of our ancestors. In the face of unimaginable adversity, they found ways to survive and even thrive, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape our world to this day. As we tuck into our own meals, let us spare a thought for the medieval peasant, whose daily struggle for sustenance was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. For the medieval peasant, the difficulties of daily existence were intensified by the stringent religious doctrines of the Catholic Church. In a society where the Church wielded immense authority and influence, its teachings and commands permeated every facet of life, including the most fundamental human requirement, food. Crucial to the Church's dietary limitations were the ideas of fasting and abstinence. On specific days throughout the year, particularly during the Lenten season, believers were obligated to refrain from eating meat and to reduce their overall food consumption. For the already underfed peasantry, these limitations could be especially severe. Envision, if you can, the predicament of an impoverished peasant family during the 40 days of Lent. Already surviving on a meager diet of gruel and bread, they were now required to abstain from even the occasional piece of salted pork or dried fish that added a touch of flavor and nourishment to their meals. The rumbling of empty stomachs became a perpetual companion as they endeavored to uphold their piety amidst gnawing hunger. The tale of John and Matilda, a fictional yet all too common peasant couple, exemplifies the hardships endured by many. During this period, with a small parcel of land and a few emaciated chickens, they barely sustained themselves and their 3 children in the best of times. When Lent commenced, they dutifully stored away their scant provisions of preserved meat and accepted a diet of thin gruel and boiled turnips. As days passed, their energy diminished and their tempers grew short. The children, too young to comprehend the reasons for their deprivation, wept ceaselessly from hunger. John, a devout man, struggled to maintain his faith in the face of such adversity, while Matilda secretly fantasized about the savory stew she would prepare once Lent concluded. The couple's situation was not isolated. Across the land, peasant families confronted similar challenges, their already limited diets further constrained by the Church's decrees. Some, driven by desperation, resorted to poaching in royal forests, risking harsh punishment if apprehended. Others simply endured without, their bodies weakening and their spirits faltering under the weight of their devotion. While the motives behind the Church's dietary rules were ostensibly admirable to foster spiritual reflection and penance, lay effect on the peasantry was often calamitous. In a society already afflicted by scarcity and inequality, the added encumbrance of religious fasting could mean the difference between life and death. Yet, even amidst such hardship, there were flickers of hope and compassion. Monasteries and abbeys, with their extensive land holdings and well-stocked larders, often served as a source of food aid for the poor. Monks and nuns, bound by their vows of charity and hospitality, would distribute bread and ale to the hungry, providing a brief respite from the gnawing pain of an empty belly. One such story tells of a kind-hearted abbess named Hildegard who, upon seeing the gaunt faces of the peasants who came to her abbey seeking alms, ordered her kitchens to prepare a hearty pottage of vegetables and barley to be distributed to all who asked. The grateful recipients, their spirits lifted by this unexpected act of kindness, returned to their homes with renewed strength and a glimmer of hope in their hearts. Such acts of compassion, however, were all too rare in a world where the divide between rich and poor was vast and unyielding. The Church, for all its teachings of love and charity, was often complicit in maintaining the rigid social hierarchy that kept the peasantry in a state of perpetual poverty and hunger. As we reflect on the role of religion in shaping the culinary landscape of medieval Europe, it is important to recognize the complex interplay of faith, power, and social inequality that defined the era. For the peasantry, food was not merely a matter of sustenance, but a daily reminder of their place in a world where even the most basic of human needs could be subject to the whims of the powerful. In our final chapter, we will explore the concept of the medieval feast and how it served as a stark contrast to the daily realities faced by the common people. Through the lens of this lavish display of wealth and abundance, we will come to understand the true depths of the inequality that defined the era, and the ways in which food served as both a source of nourishment and a symbol of social division. But first, Let us pause for a moment and imagine ourselves in the place of the medieval peasant. Their hunger a constant companion, and their faith tested by the unyielding dictates of the church. In their struggles and their resilience, we may find a deeper appreciation for the abundance and choice that we so often take for granted in our own lives. As we have observed, the existence of a medieval peasant was characterized by relentless hardship and scarcity, with food representing a daily ordeal rather than a source of enjoyment or solace. Yet, in stark juxtaposition to this somber reality, there existed an entirely different realm, that of the royal feast. In the magnificent halls of castles and palaces, the aristocracy would convene to partake in extravagant banquets that were a far cry from the meager sustenance of the common populace. These feasts were not merely an exhibition of affluence and authority, but also an emblem of the vast disparity that separated the ruling class from the masses. Envision, if you will, the spectacle of a grand medieval feast. The great hall is aglow with the dancing light of innumerable candles, their warm radiance illuminating the opulent tapestries and gleaming silver adorning the walls. The tables are laden with an extensive assortment of dishes, each more magnificent than the last. At the tables, center rests a splendid roasted boar, its crisp, golden skin shimmering with fat. Surrounding it are platters of roasted fowl, their succulent meat filled with exotic spices and herbs. There are pies brimming with tender game, their flaky crusts concealing a wealth of savory delights. And everywhere, fruits and vegetables of every color abound, their vibrant hues a testament to the land's bounty. Overseeing this lavish presentation is the royal cook, a master of his profession who has devoted days to preparing for this momentous occasion. He has traversed the countryside in search of the finest ingredients, procuring the freshest meats. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink. In the dimly lit, constricted avenues of a medieval town, a baker named Ailric wiped perspiration from his forehead as he labored over his most recent bread batch. The harvest had been insufficient this year, and grain costs were escalating. To manage financially, Ailric had resorted to secretly augmenting his dough with fillers such as ground acorns, sawdust, and even chalk. This was a widespread tactic among dishonest bakers aiming to enhance their profits, even if it meant sacrificing the quality and safety of their bread. As Ailric toiled, his thoughts drifted to the alewife on the adjacent street, who was notorious for diluting her brew to extend its supply. In a world where unpolluted drinking water was frequently scarce, ale and wine were the preferred beverages for most individuals. However, this also signified that the quality of these drinks was often, at best, dubious. In larger urban centers, authorities did make efforts to regulate the food and drink commerce to some degree. Ale tasters were hired to confirm that brews adhered to a specific standard, and bakers discovered adulterating their bread could incur fines or even public disgrace. In London, for instance, deceitful bakers might be paraded through the streets on a hurdle, their substandard loaves displayed around their necks. Nevertheless, these regulations were often inadequately enforced, and the penalties were not always a strong enough deterrent. Many bakers and brewers simply viewed the fines as an operational expense and persisted in cutting corners whenever feasible. For the average person, this meant that the food and drink they consumed were frequently of questionable quality. Bread intended to nourish them might instead be laden with inedible or even hazardous materials. Ale meant to satisfy their thirst might be so diluted that it offered little refreshment. It was merely another difficulty in a life already replete with challenges and uncertainties. As Ailric extracted his latest bread batch from the oven, he could not suppress a feeling of guilt. He knew his customers relied on him to provide honest, wholesome food, but in a world where survival often necessitated cutting corners and bending rules, he felt he had limited options. He could only hope his minor deceptions remained undetected and that his bread would offer some slight comfort to those who consumed it, even if it was not entirely what it appeared to be. Unsanitary conditions. In the year 1216, King John of England partook in a lavish meal following a long day of hunting. As was traditional, he was offered a selection of dishes, including fruit, meat, and sweet confections. However, unbeknownst to the king, the peaches he ate that day were spoiled, likely due to incorrect storage and handling. Shortly after the meal, John became severely ill with dysentery, an illness that would ultimately take his life. While the precise cause of King John's demise has been debated by historians, his story highlights a grim reality of medieval existence. Unsanitary conditions were widespread, and they exacted a serious toll on people's health and well-being. In many medieval households, livestock were frequently kept indoors for warmth and security. While this arrangement offered some comfort and safety, it also meant that homes were perpetually contaminated with animal waste and vermin. Fleas, lice, and rats were common inhabitants, spreading disease and making life unpleasant for the human occupants. The situation was even more dire in medieval cities, where refuse and human excrement were often simply discarded into the streets or nearby rivers. Lacking an understanding of germ theory or the significance of hygiene, people lived in close proximity to filth and squalor, creating an ideal breeding ground for disease. The repercussions of these unsanitary conditions were severe. Dysentery, like that which killed King John, was a frequent killer, transmitted through contaminated food and water. Other diseases, such as typhoid fever, cholera, and even the feared Black Death also flourished in the filthy environments of medieval cities. For the average individual, there was little escape from the constant menace of illness. Even the food they consumed and the water they drank were often tainted with disease-causing microbes. In a world without antibiotics or modern medical knowledge, even a minor infection could swiftly become life-threatening. The story of King John's death, while noteworthy due to his status, was far from unique. For rich and poor alike, the specter of disease and death was a constant presence, fueled in large part by the unsanitary conditions in which they lived. It was a grim reality of medieval life, and one that would persist for centuries until the advent of modern sanitation and hygiene practices. As the sun set over the medieval city, the stench of waste and decay hung heavy in the air. In the distance, the bells of the church tolled, a somber reminder of the many lives claimed by the filth and squalor of the streets. For the people of the city, it was just another day in a world where cleanliness was a luxury and disease was a constant companion. Part 6. The Church's Influence. In a modest cottage on the periphery of a medieval village, a peasant family assembled for their meager evening repast. The fare was plain: a thin pottage concocted from vegetables and a fragment of salted pork, accompanied by a hard piece of bread. It was Lent, and the family was striving to observe the Church's directive to fast and abstain from meat during this sacred period. For the peasants, the Lenten fast posed a particularly arduous challenge. Their diets were already severely constrained by their poverty and the scarcity of food. Forgoing what little meat they could access meant subsisting on an even more inadequate and monotonous diet than usual. The Church's impact on medieval cuisine was substantial and extensive. In addition to the Lenten fast, the Church also enforced meatless days throughout the year, typically Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. For the affluent, these limitations were a minor inconvenience, but for the impoverished, they could signify the difference between a satisfied stomach and hunger. Despite the difficulties imposed by the Church's dietary regulations, there were some minor consolations. Monasteries and abbeys often supplied food aid to the hungry as a form of charity. Monks and nuns would distribute bread, ale, and sometimes even meat to the poor, particularly on holy days and festivals. However, this charity was not always sufficient to mitigate the suffering of the peasantry. In times of extreme scarcity, some peasants resorted to poaching game from the royal forests, risking severe penalties if apprehended. The Church, in cooperation with secular authorities, strictly enforced these hunting prohibitions regarding poaching as a sin against God and a crime against the king. As the peasant family concluded their scant Lenten meal, they bowed their heads in prayer, thanking God for what little they possessed. They knew the fast would not endure indefinitely and that Easter would bring a brief respite from the monotony and scarcity of their diet. But they also understood that the Church's influence on their daily lives would persist long after Lent had passed. The cycle of fasting and feasting, of scarcity and abundance, was intricately woven into the fabric of medieval existence, shaping not only what people ate, but also how they lived and worshipped. In the grand cathedrals and humble parish churches, priests preached the virtues of fasting and self-denial. But for the peasants, these virtues were not a choice, but a necessity. They lived their lives under the Church's shadow, their stomachs rumbling with hunger as they prayed for a better world to come. Unsanitary environments. Beyond the difficulties of scarcity, spoilage, and adulteration, the people of the Middle Ages also had to face the constant threat of disease. In a world without germ theory or modern sanitation, food and water were frequently contaminated with dangerous pathogens, transforming every meal into a potential game of chance. The very living conditions of medieval individuals worked against any concept of food safety. Many peasants shared their modest cottages with their livestock, with animals like cattle and chickens residing under the same roof as the family. While this setup offered some warmth and security for the animals, it also meant that animal waste and insects were a perpetual presence in the home, contaminating food, water, and surfaces. Cities were even worse, with narrow, filthy streets and crowded tenements creating ideal breeding grounds for disease. Garbage, human waste, and animal carcasses accumulated in the gutters, polluting the air and seeping into the water supply. The stench alone would have been overpowering, but the real danger resided in the millions of microbes teeming on every surface. It is hardly surprising that medieval people had such short lifespans, with disease felling both young and old. Even the nobility were not exempt, despite their superior living conditions. The tragic tale of King John of England serves as a cautionary example. In 1216, while on a military campaign, the king overindulged in peaches and cider, only to fall violently ill and die a few days later. Chroniclers of the time attributed his death to gluttony, but modern historians suspect that the actual culprit was more likely food poisoning from contaminated fruit. The greatest scourge of the medieval world, the Black Death, was partly facilitated by the unsanitary conditions in which people lived. The plague was spread by rats and fleas, which thrived in the squalor of medieval cities and towns. With garbage and waste piling up and hygiene standards virtually non-existent, it was only a matter of time before the pestilence took hold, decimating a third of Europe's population. It is a grim depiction, but it is important to remember that medieval people were not ignorant or unconcerned about cleanliness. They may not have understood the science behind disease transmission, but they recognized the importance of keeping food and water clean. Monasteries and hospitals often had strict hygiene rules, and medieval housewives took great pride in keeping their homes as spotless as possible. But in a world without refrigeration, proper sewage systems, or clean running water, there was only so much that could be done. Every day was a battle against the forces of decay and contamination, and all too often, those forces triumphed. So, the next time you enjoy a meal in a clean, modern kitchen, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors who fought that battle every day of their lives, with the odds firmly stacked against them. Part 6. The Church's influence. In the medieval world, the Catholic Church exerted significant control over every facet of existence, and food was no different. For believers, the religious calendar determined what could be consumed and when, introducing an additional layer of difficulty to an already challenging food situation. The Church enforced stringent fasting and abstinence regulations, particularly during the reflective Lenten season. For 40 days preceding Easter, meat was strictly forbidden, as were dairy products, eggs, and even olive oil in some areas. Fish was occasionally allowed, but for many impoverished peasants, even that was an unaffordable luxury. Imagine the struggle of a peasant family, already teetering on the brink of starvation. confronted with the necessity of relinquishing what little meat and dairy they possessed for the sake of spiritual purity. The growling stomachs and enfeebled bodies were a minor sacrifice. They were informed, for the assurance of eternal salvation, but that offered little solace to a mother observing her children become thin and lethargic from hunger, even outside of Lent. The Church's influence was palpable in the weekly meal patterns. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were designated as lean days, when meat was prohibited. For the wealthy, this merely meant substituting fish or other expediences, but for the poor, it often meant forgoing any animal protein entirely. There were, however, some small acts of mercy. Monasteries and abbeys frequently provided food aid to the hungry as part of their charitable mission. Monks would distribute bread, soup, and ale to the needy, offering a rare respite from the gnawing hunger that was a constant companion for so many. Some even welcomed travelers, providing a warm meal and a bed for the night to those who could not afford an inn. Yet even this generosity had its limitations. The Church was also a significant landowner, controlling vast expanses of agricultural land and forests. Peasants who dared to poach game from these lands to feed their families faced severe punishment, including fines, whippings, and even exile. The irony of a supposedly charitable institution hoarding its wealth while its followers starved was not lost on many. The impact of the Church's dietary restrictions on the medieval populace cannot be overstated. For people already struggling to find enough to eat, the added burden of religious fasting and abstinence could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, the fear of eternal damnation was a powerful motivator, compelling people to endure even the most extreme privations for the sake of their immortal souls. Today, we may view these practices as archaic and even cruel. But for medieval people, they were a fundamental part of the fabric of life. The Church's hold on the hearts and minds of the faithful was unquestioned, and its dictates carried the weight of divine law. To defy them was to risk not only earthly punishment but also the fires of hell itself. And so, with clenched teeth and rumbling bellies, the people of the Middle Ages persevered, secure in the knowledge that their suffering would be rewarded in the world to come. And so we reach the conclusion of our exploration through the somber realities of medieval cuisine. It stands as a testament to human fortitude that individuals manage to survive, and at times even prosper, on such a scant and undependable food supply. The scarcity, the spoilage, the sheer repetitiveness of gruel upon gruelet is enough to inspire gratitude for the simple delight of a crisp apple or a well-seasoned curry. Can you envision the amazement on a medieval peasant's face if they were suddenly transported to a modern supermarket? The gleaming aisles overflowing with more food than a king's banquet hall, the vibrant array of fresh fruits and vegetables. In the produce section, the fragrant loaves of bread that would have seemed like divine providence to a hungry serf, and the sheer abundance of it, all enough food to sustain a village, all conveniently located under one roof. Naturally, we still encounter challenges in our contemporary food system: inequality, waste, environmental harm. These are all matters we must address. But we have also achieved incredible advancements since the era of rancid meat pies and turnip gruel. We possess a greater understanding of nutrition, of food safety, of the significance of variety and balance in our diets. We have the capability to preserve and transport food over vast distances, to enjoy flavors from across the globe in our own kitchens. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to truly appreciate it. Acknowledge the intricate blend of flavors, the freshness of the ingredients, the skill of the preparation, and spare a thought for our medieval ancestors who endured so much hardship and hunger in the face of such scarcity. And with that, we conclude our unexciting history of medieval food. I hope it has offered some valuable context to your understanding of the past and perhaps even guided you into a peaceful slumber. If you found this presentation enjoyable, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more sleep-inducing historical content. Until next time, pleasant dreams.